welcome everyone to our final breakout session for today. I believe it's our final breakout session. Let me just make sure that I'm right before I say that. Yes, our final breakout session for today. So I have the pleasure of introducing to you Dr. Paul Sachs. Dr. Sachs is acting chief psychologist of Mid-Hudson Forensic Psychiatric Center and teaches at Teachers College, Columbia University. And he also has degrees in classics and medieval studies. And today he will be presenting to us The Mask of the Beast, Extreme States, Madness, and Exile into Otherness as Depicted in History, Art, and Culture. So we will have a Q&A at the end of his talk. And please feel free to unmute yourself that you might have for Dr. Sachs in the chat. But other than that, take it away, Dr. Sachs.
I will indeed. Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending my lecture. Let me just get my slides up. To work great. As I was just introduced, I am currently working as a forensic psychologist. I am the chief psychologist acting at Mid-Hudson Forensic Psychiatric Center. However, I love doing stuff like this because I can integrate other parts of myself and other epochs of my life. And before becoming a psychologist, I actually worked in the arts. And for many years, I was a curatorial assistant at the Cloisters, now called the Met Cloisters, the medieval department of the Met. My undergraduate work was in classics and medieval studies. And I still tend to always think in terms of art. Another interest of mine is the marginalization and the othering of the mentally ill. And I think that one can really see this process take place throughout history. And one of the ways that we can, of course, examine history are through the images of art. And by art, I mean physical art, decorative art. As we go into later eras of history, movies, films, things like that. I also want to say that as my Jewish grandmother instilled in me, it is an absolute sin to run out of matzo balls at a dinner. So I have made too many slides. I have too many matzo balls in my soup. I want to make sure that I can feed everybody. So there's no way I'm going to get through all of the material. So at some point I will be asked again, I'll ask that somebody, Hallie actually, tell me to shut up in a nice way, and I will take questions. However, if there is something just unbearable that you have to ask me, you can type questions into chat. And if I'm able to stop my ruminating on things, I will try and address your questions. So tonight, this afternoon, I am going to talk in many ways about monsters. This means that we'll also, to a lesser extent, be talking about their dichotomous, and to me, their less interesting cousins, gods and heroes. There's always been a curious connection between the way we conceptualize those deemed to be mentally ill and the monsters that haunt our nightmares and lurk under the beds of our terrified children. It's a sordid and tragic history filled with episodes of discrimination, captivity, torture in the name of science, and sometimes in the name of just plain torture, and genocide. As a forensic psychologist who works in a maximum security hospital, I also worked for several years in the sex offender unit of that hospital. I work with those that many have relegated to the term of monsters. I've worked with men who have murdered their mothers, women who have murdered their children, even those who have literally devoured their victims through acts of mutilation and cannibalism. This tends to be rare, but it does happen. But I contend that what makes these people, and never forget that they are indeed people, truly terrifying is not the ways in which their horrific acts make them different from us, but the ways in which any of us can see ourselves in any of them. The lines between sickness and sanity are so incredibly tenuous that we've always needed to preserve our fragile sanity by rendering the mentally ill as the ultimate other. To understand people with the disorder called schizophrenia is to grasp painful facts about the human condition, things that we would rather know, or more frightening, to be reminded of painful facts that we once knew but have repressed. Balancing between fear and loneliness is the best description of what it feels like to have psychotic symptoms. But that, I think, is what most people do not want to hear, do not want to think about, do not want to understand. And while the ways in which we have done this has changed throughout the ages, the processes of splitting, projection, and displacement have remained the primary vehicles for maintaining the otherness of those we have deemed to be freaks, psychos, witches, degenerates, heretics, crazies, nutjobs, hysterics. Much can be learned by the ways in which societies depict their monsters and in turn marginalize the mentally ill. For the images and representations in art, literature, cinema, and popular culture speak volumes about the anxieties, fears, and traumas of the ages from which they emerged. So, sorry. I want to start with a few quotes. One of my favorites by Ray Bradbury. Insanity is relative. It depends on who has locked who in what cage. Denise, can we refrain from saying the mentally ill? I can, but I'm trying to use the language of the images and the art from which I am taking it, but I will try and be sensitive to that. I want to begin at the point of the dichotomy, and by the way, I'm going to use words like madness, insanity, because I think that they are important to the historical context. They're not words that I use in my work, but I think for the purpose of this discourse, they are important to use. We begin our story with the age-long dichotomy, duality of what was perceived to be good and evil. I'll start with a quote by Robert Louis Stevenson from the masterpiece, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I learned to recognize the thorough and primitive duality of man. I saw that of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be either, it was only because I was radically both. So I think through most of history, and certainly in religions, the major religions of the world, there's been a focus on an eternal battle, a duality between what was deemed to be good, righteous, godly, divine, and what was deemed to be evil, demonic, unrighteous, heretical. These are two images from different eras of history that depict similar things. You have the ancient Egyptian dichotomy between the good god, and in this case, Osiris. Actually, that's Ra, I'm sorry, and his evil brother, Horus. And very often, the good and evil either started out as siblings. In the case of, on the right, the divine battle between the forces of good and the demons of evil, the battle between God and Jesus and Satan from Christian iconography. It also begins, that of course, Lucifer was an angel of God. So there's an acknowledgement that that both of these can reside within each of us. Throughout a lot of history, there was almost an idea that we were pieces in a divine game, or also perhaps empty vessels in which these divine entities played out their own battles. What was termed as madness or mental distress for, again, a lot of human history was seen as external entities possessing, influencing, commanding humans. And very often, images of madness, insanity, were depicted as the gods who they represented. On the bottom, I have images here of the Assyrian Babylonian demon Mamitu, who, amongst other things, caused things like plagues and famines and stillbirth children, but also caused madness in people. Another similar spirit from the Near East was Lamashtu. On the left, there's an actual image from a Babylonian work of art. On the right is the modern fanboy rendering. But again, it was the idea that illness, and particularly things like mental distress, was actually caused by some kind of external force. More images of demons, spirits, that amongst other things would cause mental distress. I present this because this is a fascinating piece of work. This is a Babylonian cuneiform tablet that has what's called the Poem of the Righteous Sufferer. And we can go back and analyze it. And perhaps it is a description of what now we would call paranoia or paranoid distress. Just a little bit of a translation of that. My God has forsaken me and disappeared. My goddess has failed me and keeps at a distance. The benevolent angel who walked beside me has departed. My projecting spirit has taken to flight and is seeking someone else. My strength is gone. My appearance has become gloomy. As it goes on, you start to see almost suggestions of paranoia. The courtiers plot hostile action against me. They assemble themselves and give utterance to impious words. So this is an individual suffering distress who very frankly talks about his experiences in this ancient work of writing. As far as other depictions, sometimes also mental distress has been used for political purposes. These are images of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. He reigned from about 600 BC to the middle of the 500s. BC. By Babylonian accounts, he was a wonderful king. He was also the king who destroyed the first temple and destroyed Jerusalem. So in the Bible, he is rendered as one who is punished by God for his arrogance, for his pride, for his destruction of the temple, and is rendered mad. This is from the book of Daniel. Immediately the world concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and nails like birds' claws. So this is a motif that we will see again and again, that mental distress, madness, insanity is a punishment from God, that because of the sins, the misdeeds of the person, there is some form of divine retribution that causes them to act in these ways. So again, mental distress is seen as a wholly external factor, but that one that sort of links with the intrinsic sinfulness or badness of the person. You also see this dichotomy, and I do want to use the word madness here, between bad madness and good divine madness. So you have the kind of behavior that's the punishment of God, but experiences that I think we would now consider to be the symptoms of mental distress, of hallucinations, hearing voices, was considered sort of this good madness. This is one of the earliest representations in graphic image of the prophet Ezekiel. This is from the temple of Dora Europos, which is one of the oldest, not really surviving, but one of the oldest Hebrew Jewish temples in what's now Syria. It's from the Roman period. So this is about 250 AD. And there's a series of frescoes, and the portion that I have here, and these are both Ezekiel. And so the panel we're looking at starts from here. If you can see my little arrow, it's Ezekiel preaching the destruction, the upcoming destruction of the temple. So here you see the body parts of the Jewish people who will be killed and annihilated. But here you see that hand is an artistic motif that we will see again and again. It's contact with the voice of God. It's the hand of God reaching down into the mind, into the body, into the soul of the prophet and communicating. So again, what today we might consider hallucinations and voices, or perhaps, you know, in my hospital, grandiose delusions, in different eras of history, has been seen as contact with the divine, making one a prophet. This is a later depiction of the story of Ezekiel, in which he had these visions of fantastic beasts and the destruction of the temple. And again, at a different time of history, we call them visions. Perhaps now we would call it madness. I'm just going to skip this. That's from Ezekiel. For these images, I borrow from Foucault's masterwork. The correct translation is Madness and Civilization. The translation that many of us knew it by was a history of madness. Throughout history, there has been a connection between leprosy and madness. These are images of lepers and leprosy at different periods of history. And for the lepers were othered, marginalized. They were literally even either driven out of cities or towns or housed in leper colonies or leperariums. These are some images of leperariums. Interestingly, though, with the cessation of leprosy in Western Europe, which just spontaneously started to happen in the latter part of the Middle Ages, what once had been leper houses were then converted into buildings to house what became the marginalized others after that, people experiencing mental distress. The Greeks took up to some extent in Greek mythology this idea of madness as divine punishment. You see this in this amphora depicting Heracles. We have the story from the Euripides play, but as punishment from the gods, Heracles went mad, slaughtered his family, and then as punishment for that, engaged in his famous labors. Ritual madness, the Bacchanalia, right? Well, actually, this is Orpheus encountering those worshiping Dionysus or Bacchus, whipped up in a frenzy of madness and being torn apart. Here, though, this was not seen as any kind of punishment, but this was seen as contact with the divine. This is from the Bacchae by Euripides. And one of my personal favorite cycles of Greek play, of Greek tragedy, is the Oresteia. The left is an image taken depicting something from the final play, the Eumenides, which depicts Orestes being tortured by the Furies. So his mother, Clytemnestra, murdered his father, Agamemnon, and in revenge, he murdered his mother, and then he went through a period of being punished from the gods. So here, mental distress is again seen as these external entities torturing, punishing, sending voices to achieve some kind of divine retribution. On the left, we have an original Greek amphora image. On the right, there's a later 19th century rendering of that. There are also spirits and demons that cause mental distress. This is an image of Lisa, the daughter of Nyx, who sprung from the blood of Ouranos. I want to actually skip a bit to the Middle Ages. So before that, I had some images of how in the later classical period, you start to see mental distress. The early biomedical models. The Greek physicians and some of those images I had include Soranus and Galen tried to see mental distress akin to physical illness. And the model of the humors of, of blood, bile, phlegm, and black bile was sort of the first biomedical conceptualization of mental illness, mental distress. By the time we get to the Middle Ages, we absolutely return to this concept of mental distress, madness, as being caused by the influence of external entities, angels, demons. You also see this idea of otherness. Otherness being monstrous, deranged. These are frescoes from the outer hall of the cloisters, and the one on the right is sort of a map. And the farther you get away from white Europeans, you start to see more fantastic, monstrous beasts. And again, those on the margins are depicted as monsters. You see this in a map. This is a map of Africa with all sorts of twisted, distorted, monstrous beasts. You also see similar images of those who are marginalized for being mentally ill. This is one of my favorite pieces from the cloisters, and again shows this idea of good madness. This is the diptych of Saint Aemilianus, and in the upper portion of it, you have a Roman noble, Aemilianus, until again he experienced the voice of God, is depicted as again a hand that literally is coming down and bopping him on the head and instilling him with divine. He gave away all of his property. He had his sister put in a convent, and on the bottom you have him being like Jesus was, a shepherd. You have him being a shepherd and being a good Christian. We probably only have a few minutes left, and I'm not going to get to most of my slides, but I just want to take a few minutes and talk about this idea of the cloister. This is the San Guillaume cloister in the cloisters. It's from Aquitaine and southern France from about the year 1200. And the inner part of the cloister was one of the most sacred parts of the monastery. It was the place where you can be closest to God. There's always a fountain in there, water sort of suggesting the start of life. It was the part, there's no garden in this one, it's the place where food was grown. It was the part of the most divine, safe part of the monastery. But the interesting part of it is that in the margins of the arcade, there were reminders as to the sins, the temptations, the evils of the outside world. And often these images are conflated of images of homosexuality, bestiality, overt sexuality, and mental distress. This, for example, displays twisted acrobats. Again, the outer margins. This is a bit ironic, considering perhaps what happened in some monasteries, but shows sort of an older man engaged in medieval art, beard pulling, hair pulling, finger in the mouth are images that sort of link to either manual or oral sex. So here is a man engaging in a sex act with two young men or two children. Again, men perhaps engaged in an act of homosexuality. The same here. I chose this image because it serves as a warning sign. Very often in the Middle Ages and in later art, you see those with mental distress presented as disheveled, as having their hair let down, uncovered. Here, she's not pulling at her hair, but that is a motif as well. This is an image of a quote, fallen, loose woman. Her hair is down. She's not sitting with crossed legs. But this also has some of the motifs that you will see depicted in those who are supposedly mad, insane, marginalized. I think I have to stop. We're actually at the 450 mark. So I apologize for not getting to all of these slides. But why don't—
Dr. Sachs,
yes.
You have till 5:15.
So okay. Okay. Right.
We keep going. We can stop maybe around 5.
I will keep going. I miss right. I have until 5. Right. So this is another cloister. This is the Mont Saint-Michel de Coucha, slightly later, but here you actually see the garden. I'm going to skip ahead a bit. Another image of moral depravity in medieval art is often connected to monkeys. And here you see, and again, there's often a conflation between moral, sexual depravity and mental distress. These were all individuals who are on the margins. Also on the margins of the Middle Ages were actors, acrobats. They were considered on the fringe. So again, there's often a conflation between acrobats, actors, images of them, animals like monkeys, and acts of either sexual or violent depravity. Not my turn, but trying to capture what they were trying to capture. Images again of twisted beasts. These also relate to the ideas of hell, and very often those on the margin, those who were different, were relegated to internal damnation in hell. Skip this one. Another interesting motif that came to really equate with madness was the image of the wild man. In medieval art, the wild man was one who had forsaken the rules of society, who had thrown off his clothes, who engaged in acts of sexuality, of violence. In many of the great romances, like the ones by Chrétien de Troyes, who served as the basis for many of the later Arthurian myths. And Chrétien wrote ballads and romances of Lancelot and Galahad. Most of the knights in these stories have a period in which they are driven mad by love or rejection of love and become wild men. Less than human, bestial, manic creatures. So there's this weird dichotomy. On the one hand, they're marginalized and vilified, This is, again, an image of a wild man from a medieval romance. They come to represent the forsaking of goodness, of, into madness. But there's also, at times, a heroic quality to the wild man. Images of those on the margins, those who have been othered, those who were considered simple-minded or foolish or mad, also comes from images of fools, of jesters, of jokers. They served their purpose in the Middle Ages, but again, they were absolutely on the fringes. There might have been one or two in the king's court to be a source of amusement, but for the most part, those who were mad were driven out of society. Perhaps also much of the nightmarish quality of forests and being outside of towns that you later see in things like fairy tales of Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood comes from the tradition of the forests and places outside of the town or the city being the places where those who were marginalized were driven out. So aside from thieves or bandits, it was also where people with mental distress were often driven out of the cities and towns and resided in these places that then grew reputations as being fearful. Just very quickly, these are images of the Middle Ages of King Charles VII, who was actually called Charles VI, the Mad King of France. Early in his reign, he had what we would now perhaps call a psychotic break. He began to have hallucinations. He began to have paranoid delusions. His, quote, madness began, an attempt was made on his life, and he gathered all of his nobles together to try and go hunting for the people that he thought were conspiring against him. He had what perhaps we would now call a psychotic break and started to attack his most trusted friends and advisors and killed at least one of them. Psychiatrists and psychologists retroactively now think that perhaps he had bipolar disorder and he had manic episodes and then periods of very severe depressive episodes. And this is one of the most tragic elements of his reign. This happened in 1373. It's called the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of Fire. Perhaps in a bit of a manic episode, he decided to have him and his young friends dress as wild men. They attached actual hair with tar to their bodies and were dancing around. Unfortunately, somebody with a torch came into the chamber and accidentally set one of the young men on fire, and the fire soon spread, and a lot of the young nobles of France were incinerated. Another historical case of one who now people suggest experienced schizophrenia is Henry VI. This is a depiction of him. Another picture of Henry VI. Since we're showing pictures of royalty, this is my dog, Isabel. I always throw pictures of my dog. Another picture of Isabel. To borrow from Foucault again, in the latter part of the Middle Ages, as we start to transition into the Renaissance, you still see images of madness depicted as external factors. Here, this is St. Anthony Abbot wrestling with demons. However, there's a little bit of an acknowledgement. Foucault calls monsters like these griots, in that they become more abstract, they become sort of more bizarre, and it's perhaps an indication that we're starting to understand that perhaps these experiences are not totally external, but perhaps that these experiences are things that originate within us and are part of who we are. In the latter part of the Middle Ages, you also see another artistic motif start to develop, and that's the Ship of Fools. It started with the idea of putting those who are different and, in this case, those who are considered fools or mad or insane into a ship and setting the ship a sail to sort of get them away. It then became sort of more of a symbolic, figurative motif. I began by saying that also those with mental distress become the sources of projecting out the anxieties of society. And at times in which anxiety was on sinfulness, on being properly connected to God, those with mental distress became very much equated with debauchery, sin, and thus had to be driven away as a way of keeping the self pure. This is an image from the sort of the beginning of the Renaissance. It's the image that I had at the beginning of my presentation. This is a stained glass rondel from the lowlands, probably now modern Holland, that depicts hell, those being cast into hell. But again, it also depicts images of those who were driven mad by their sin, by the torture of being in hell, and particularly this woman here who is running around naked, but tearing the hair out of her own head out of distress, yet again speaks to this conflation of mental distress, madness, sin, being some kind of divine punishment. By the time you get to Bosch, and this is from the Garden of Earthly Delights, the late 1500s, you again have more of an acknowledgement of not so much that mental illness, mental distress is a purely external factor, but it's something that perhaps originates from within us. So here you have in the center, I mean, there's a lot going on in this, but the focal point of this small portion of the painting is the face in the center, which is a depiction of madness. Literally on his brain, you have a balance between Eve being tempted by the serpent of sin, trying to balance out with the owl of wisdom. You have a little monkey there. So on either side, right, there's the owl, which is logic, reason, um, behaving properly. On the other side, you have a monkey, which is sin, sexual deviance, being from the margins of society. Monkeys are also equated by the way of coming from places like Africa, where people of different races came from, who also represented a deviance, a marginalization from being a pure white Christian. But again, you see sort of more of this internal struggle. It's not so much things that are on the outside trying to influence him, but it sort of represents his internal struggles, the internal things going on within him. I'm going to skip Blake, who I love.
I also want to give you it's a 5 o'clock warning.
Okay. Why don't we stop here and we can have some discussion. Obviously, there's things that I did not get to, but I think we have enough to discuss for the last 15 minutes.